We're going to start talking about this huge topic about critical path. And essentially it's really about organization, which is probably the most key thing that you're going to do in business or in most things that you do in the industry. Whether you're doing it for yourself or you're working for someone else, it'll be the same kind of systems of things. It's really massive. So we'll touch on everything, but to be fair, we could sit here for probably 4 days and go through the whole thing. So we'll get everything from beginning to end, from kind of like product development to kind of production. And then as Trina said, the second part is about shipments and stuff like that, which is a whole other drama. But we can start with basically talking about, as a designer or as a brand, the first thing that you do in kind of the cycle of the whole business and the system.
Yep.
So where do we start? Where does the designer start?
So just to step back what Todd has been saying, it's the principle behind it is massive and too complex. It starts with the design kickoff, let's say. So you start building your inspiration and everything, which is the part of the design. So I would say everything starts with where you get your inspiration from and the design kickoff.
And basically. This is even before you start thinking about product.
Exactly. This is before you start thinking about the product. I think we can start with discussing how you would design the product, and then once you think that it can come alive as a product, where we can step in with the product development.
Yeah, because one of the things that from my own experiences about that is basically once you have a concept or you have your designs or you're thinking about what you're going to do for a collection, whatever it is, whether it's accessories or clothing, one of the first things to do is almost to create a shopping list. So when you're going to trade shows or you're going to suppliers, have a list in mind of what you actually need. You're not just going to find things in general, you're going to find some specific things. You'll come across other things as you go along, but it's really important to be focused right from the very beginning. Because if you're not, you're kind of going to end up coming back with almost more work on your plate. So we were talking about that idea of going with like a really identifiable shopping list, and also making sure that you're not duplicating things.
Let's say you have the shopping list, you know what you want, the fabric, etc. So you're out there shopping, looking for your fabric, looking for your trim, and there is an element of looking or seeing, and which is actually constitutes all the way down how you create the product. So I was saying, okay, how to shop more than what to shop more is the key. Because you can like a fabric that you may not question the minimum. You may find out down the road the minimum is 1,000 meters, whereas you can only need maybe 50 meters. Or the fabric you like may not have available colors or may not have the time frame that you would need that product to get done. So everything that you would start from that onwards has to be think all the way through. So it's not just finding the fabric you would desire to have your design in, it's also finding that element that how you would build the product towards the end when you look at that fabric, because that will go through all the way down your prototyping, all the way down your sample, and all the way down production. So it's not just getting the fabric out there, it's thinking through the whole process.
Including things like not only pricing, things like delivery times. Some fabric companies have a delivery time of 12 weeks. So when you actually start to put that into your play, that's for bulk, for your production. So you need to be thinking about all these things when you're actually sourcing. Think about price, minimums, lead times, right from the beginning, because all those things are going to affect you later on. And sometimes if you're not, you're going to be in a bad situation later on down the path.
Yep. Asking the right question from day one is the key for in every angle of constituting or establishing your brand. As Todd say, looking at the lead times, if it's sensible within your time frame, the MOQs, minimum order quantities, the lead time, payment terms with that supplier, because that will change your cash flow, how much money you need upfront and how much money you'll make selling that product, because there is a gap in between. The money, the cash flow, the finances that you put upfront to build your product is also, there is a gap in between when you sell and take your money back. So all these has to be thinking all the way at the very first beginning, not to fail at the end. So asking the right question from that onwards is where you start after design, thinking fully in every angle if it's covered.
And also when you work with suppliers, it's best to find the ones that you like to work with, because quite often if you work with a group of suppliers, they will help you out. If they know you and they've worked with you for a long time and basically your quantities are growing, they will help you rather than just going to all new suppliers all the time. So sometimes it's really good to build those relationships. They will actually help you. In some cases save you, because sometimes you can go, I've gone to suppliers in the past where one supplier's let me down and another one has actually made the fabric that I needed in a very quick turnaround because they knew me and they wanted to help. So those situations, like those relationships, become quite important as you grow.
The other element is, instead of spreading out all suppliers and cherry picking who treats you nice and well, is not the key usually, because building the relationship and the trust is all happening with the third party suppliers or your partners, so to speak, because they really out there, they really don't need your business. They have already running through so many things. So the competition is quite tough. So the way how you communicate with them, the way you build the trust and the relationship with them is always the key, establishing the fundamentals as you step into this world, because it gets really complex down the road. So that, I think I would say, the shopping list that we receive from product development angle as trim and fabric. And there is also, I think, another shopping list that goes under this, because after, I think, you create the product material, there is another layer of design that you create silhouettes and, you know, the product that becomes in a body, like trousers or tops, etc. That's the second shopping list I would like to talk about a little bit, which is shapes and silhouettes, because that comes down to from fabric sourcing to the manufacturer sourcing, who would produce your garment.
Finding your production partners as well. Finding ones that you can trust, finding ones that deliver on time, finding ones that actually do what you want to do, that put you treat you well as opposed to put you to the back of the queue, which a lot of them will do. The other thing too, which I always sort of say, when you're dealing with fabric companies or manufacturers, be really honest about what you're doing in terms of the numbers. If you go to a factory and tell them that you can meet the 100-piece minimum and you turn around with 20 pieces, they may help you out for one season, but the next season they're going to leave you high and dry. If you're only doing 20 or 50 or 80 or whatever, tell them. They'll be more open. They may say no, but at least they know that they're getting the business and they know what it's about. But a lot of the times people sort of will say, even with fabric suppliers, oh yeah, I can meet the 1,000-meter minimum, and then you're begging them to do 400. It doesn't really work, you know. But if you at least go to them with an honest kind of like business plan of what you're going to do, they may not be able to help you, but quite often they will. You know, they may surcharge or whatever, but that's part of it. So I think it's really important, especially with factories. They really don't like surprises when you suddenly are trying to beg them to do 50 pieces when you said you could do 200.
It doesn't matter how small and how big your business is or would be, the principles are always the same with manufacturing. Be always transparent, provide transparency to those people, what you expect out of your business, because your business is their business. And as Todd explained, committing 100 minimums and then keep doing 20s, they will be out of the picture next season. So providing transparency and hand-holding together in building up your business is one of the key, especially in manufacturing side. One of the topics I would like to also touch upon here is the regional sourcing or local sourcing, especially when you first start your brand. You may not have the know-how or the resources to go internationally sourcing. You may want to do local sourcing, you may want to create some local manufacturing, thinking that it's easier to handle. And depending on, again, the bigger plan, how you would like to position the brand and your time frame, you should be considerate about, should I go internationally or should I discover what I have regionally? And both of them has its own pros and cons. When you go international sourcing, in a scale of, let's say, small to medium-sized businesses, there is so many information that you have to be aware of. Trading regulations, shipments, tax, and VAT that comes in and out of the goods, and the complexity those regulations it gets, it's almost at a level that you're not able to figure out on your own, that you have to have a legal advice. So everything that has to come on your plate as a Todd, always ask your second question, how I would do this. If I want to produce in Poland, let's say, to speak, what do I need to know? Or if I produce in UK, what are my, obstacles or benefits? So it's always looking at your secondary question, not the first one, because the first one is easy. I want to produce it, yes. But the complexity that goes under that is it may be difficult to figure out on your own. So it's important to be conscious and aware of what goes under that. With the sourcing from manufacturing point of view. And also the other thing which is quite important in terms of design and product development angle is you can find the best fabric, you can find the best manufacturer, you can have the best product that comes as day one in your hand. I call it as price engineering because you need to know how much it's going to cost you. You have a money to spend and you have a money to make. So it's from that point onwards, when you start communicating with external suppliers or let's say your business partners, you have to be conscious about what you can afford and what you cannot. Because it's also important to position your brand down the road because you will want to sell, you want to make money. And also at the end, you want to know how much it will cost you so that there is no surprises. I have been in so many instances that the price calculation was made at the very end that there was an 80% margin on the product. And the reality at the end was 20% because no one calculated how much that fabric cost. No one calculated properly how much was the manufacturing cost was included, or never even discussed with the manufacturer how much they would charge you to produce that. So the price engineering element has to come in that sense when you start designing and developing your product day one. So that's also another layer that brings the financial numbers and figures element. If you do it at the end, at the beginning, you will be able to see what you can do or what you cannot. But if you do it at the end, there is no way to move back or maneuver your business. And then you are stuck.
Yeah, and plus if you're dealing with different currencies, you need to bear in mind that those currencies are going to change. So what you're buying for sampling and what you're selling for production are not necessarily going to match. And that's a tough one as well, especially when the markets these days, because it's a nightmare. Everything fluctuates dramatically from one day to the next.
And imagine a world you are designing a dress that goes, let's say, on a basic sense, two different fabric. One fabric coming from Italy, one fabric coming from China. You have buttons coming from somewhere else. So there's so much going on in that dress. as an example. All these different elements and components coming from different currencies, different timeline, different people, different minimums that you all have to take into consideration on a bigger picture that you can make one dress. And it's a challenging and complex world to get into, to plan all these different elements. And imagine your collection is, let's say, to speak, 25 different dresses to make in one collection. So it gets really complex, and I want to show you here quite quickly. If you want to plan these things, this is what it looks like. If you put on a little Excel, when my fabric is coming in, when is my due date, when I want to launch this, what I want to do. And apart from a nice, beautiful, colorful sketches and design, at the back end, this is what you're looking, which doesn't look really pretty, but this is what it what it takes you to get there. So it's a complicated world to get into. It's not just finding the right product or the design. This is just a glimpse of the overall thing that we were talking now, design and product development sense. There is two slides I want to show you just as a product life cycle standpoint of view. Right now we talk about these two elements that Todd was mentioning about product development, sourcing fabric trims, shapes and silhouettes, and how complicated it gets. We touched upon maintaining your commitments, looking at back, and always stick to your original plan. Before we move on to the product development side, a little bit deeper, this is usually in a very compact snapshot. This is your product life cycle. Where you start is the first idea with design, research, design, product development, then the production launch, sourcing and production, and logistics, warehouse, distribution, which will be the part 2 of this conversation that we're not going to discuss here tonight. But these are the core elements divided on a product life cycle of a brand when you create your collection seasonally, yearly, or monthly. So this is the life cycle that you're looking into. And of course, every bucket you see there is so much going on. It's not as simple, break it down by 3. Every little thing you see here, there is at least the Excel chart I showed you before. There is so much going on like that in every angle. And the other 2 melting pots of your brand that I want to show you briefly is the one big thing is research, design, and product development that we have been discussing. The sourcing production element that we will touch, and the logistic part. So that's one core element, and the other is what Todd has been saying, how you create the product. So inspiration, trends, design, and product development. But if you don't think through while you are doing this bit over there, combining this, the melting pot becomes so complex and it becomes almost too chaotic to get through all the way end. So these are 2 different elements to look at. One of them is extremely analytical, extremely numbers and figures, dates and due dates oriented. And one of them is creating that product is the fun bit. But if you don't do the other bit while creating your product, thinking through, then it gets really complex all the way down.
Plus, I think just at the end of that, the kind of product development discussion is that you should do your sourcing and your purchasing for your components and fabrics as close to what you're going to be able to produce. The danger of buying something and saying, I'll sort it out later, will give you the biggest headache in your production. Obviously, there's always going to be 1 or 2 things, that's fine. But when you suddenly have a pile of things that you need to then sort out for production, because you didn't think you would sell it, which is ridiculous because why would you do it anyways? But it kind of becomes a bit of a nightmare that will happen later on. That happens to most people. They end up saying, I'll find it later. it's not always easy, especially when you're trying to develop yet another collection on top of it.
Yeah. It's, I'll find it later, or I'll take care of it later. That seems pretty easy. I'll do it later on. Don't leave it today's job tomorrow. Because the little things are always gets very complicated and big at the very end. We were just talking here before we start. I was giving an example about zippers that we think it's easy, or we think, oh, we can do it later, or just little typo that you would think ordering zippers, how trouble it could get. Just giving an example of ordering, a zipper on your sheet, and they have codes. So we were talking, you just by mistake, a humanly mistake, you could make one typo with one number. You could put 1 instead of 2, and the zipper color suddenly becomes green to red. And you don't realize because you ordered your zipper, that's the code, everything is perfect, and then you end up coming zippers. I carried myself by someone else's typo on a zipper code. 200 meters of rolled zippers to the showroom to fix the garments that has the correct zippers because someone made a humanly mistake by putting number 1 instead of 2. So it always goes into, again, I keep saying the same thing, but being aware of what you do, triple check everything, make sure that it's right. But still today, after spending 17 years of my career with product development and production, if I'm ordering a zipper, I still have this thing to triple check if everything is correct, ensuring, double confirming in writing that is going to happen. Because no one will take care of your business as much as you would do. So you have to be responsible and accountable of what you are putting out there. And at the end of the day, whoever produced, they won't care. And they will say, we produced it, we want our money. And then everything becomes a firefighting and troubleshooting. So that's also quite important in development, product development sense. And also, I think one of the other thing is, I like this because product development, it sounds fun, nice. I love developing a product when I work with a designer. It's the fun bit that everything you see on the paper becomes alive. There are challenges that you want to get out there, but product development also means wherever, either your own brand or working at a brand is building up your business. It's business development. That's why it has to be in the bigger picture. Always think that developing a product is developing your business. I say don't save the day, don't save the season, but save the business, because the fabric you like at the shopping list that you found and your designer wants, or if you're yourself a designer, the fabric in your dreams that you find in that shopping list, if you don't ask the question of, let's say, minimum, imagine you build up your collection based on that, you thinking that you can get away with the minimum ends up in 5,000. And you pitched everyone, you get your sampling fabric, you prototyping, and what's gonna happen? That you won't need 5,000 meters, you need only maybe 500 meters to save your season. So it again goes back all the way down that shopping list when you're developing the product. Always question where this will get me.
A lot of times, if you do less than the minimum, you pay surcharges and things, but it's not really the way to think. You'll just find other fabrics. Because surcharges end up having to go into the costings, and usually you're paying considerably more. It's not worth it. It's not worth to put a surcharge fabric into production.
Yes, exactly. Like, as I said, as we also said when we were talking, it's creative thinking. Let's say the ideal fabric you found, you really like that fabric. It's not end of the world if you can't use it. Yes, it's sad, but move on, find something else that still fits in your creative DNA of what you want to do, but take a smart risk rather than clinging onto something that you are chasing to have, but maybe the minimum or the price point doesn't, fit you, but you can be creative in your thinking, finding something else, or thinking, okay, if I do this, I can get away doing something else. So there is always an option out there. If you stuck in your little bubble, let's say, just to get that product out there, you may miss a lot of other things that may penalize you towards the end.
When you're certain fibers and things, when you're shipping to certain countries, have exponential duties and taxes on top of them. So when you're sourcing your fabrics, you do need to be careful of what those fiber contents are for some countries, especially like America. Viscose is a seriously high taxable and duty article. So you may want to make sure that potentially you're not using that. Or if you are, the viscose you're using is at such a low price that it won't actually affect it that much. You need to be really, this is where the minefield becomes even bigger. Because suddenly it's not just about the product you're making, it's where you're shipping it. Like how is it, and how does that affect the price of it? Because suddenly what you think is a good price here, when it gets to America, by the time they ship it, and by the time they add their duty and taxes and then do their margins, suddenly that product is actually outpriced the market. And suddenly it's not interesting for a consumer anymore over there. So there's lots of all those elements that need to be considered. And most often it's the higher fiber content that overrides the duty. So if it's a 60% viscose, it's considered viscose. But you could be quite clever, because you might find another one that's like, I don't know, like an acetate viscose or something, and its acetate is 60 and viscose is 40. So then suddenly it becomes a different article. So all those elements have to be thought about in development. So it's not even a question of like we're sort of saying, don't deal with it later. You have to be thinking about those things before you even get to the showroom, before you're even selling the product. And you need to, and it's complicated. You need to actually research all that stuff and find out kind of how that system works in terms of shipping. I mean, it's all going to change here potentially between the UK and Europe. We don't know what's going to happen yet. It's a bit of an open question mark.
And down the road, that pricing affects your overall business gross margin. Because, for example, another detail is like, you would get a naked cost of manufacturing. They could tell you, this garment cost me this much to make, and you know how much fabric you're going to consume, and you know your fabric price. It's a basic math. You put it and you calculate, you have your garment price. I have been in so many instances, all the way up until wholesale businesses, that the prices were given perfect. There is a perfect margin, like the sales price and how much that garment price costs you, including trims, including fabric, manufacturing. And when we look at all the way down through this closing the season and how much sales were made, what we are paying to the manufacturers and how much margin we're making, there was whole of this little black hole that nobody know where we're losing the money, because math is not matching. And then what we realized, as you explained, one of the fabric content that massively we are shipping to US has a higher rate of duty tax and shipment, and we were losing money. And also, nobody calculated the shipment cost into the product margin while calculating how much you would wholesale that product. There was 25% of price difference of actual what was produced and how much it cost and how much it sells. So suddenly the margin that the entire business were thinking, we are making a 75% margin, wow, that's great, it came down to 45%. And again, it goes back, if you don't think all the way through and what could affect you, then you end up with a disaster, basically, losing money over and over again. And because fashion ecosystem lives in a certain time frame and seasons, as we all know, your money and the business is gonna circle around that season. And can you imagine, as a running your business, losing 45% of your margin for not calculating your garment cost properly and trying to get another season straight away? Because the first season is always the easiest because you don't have any circulating expenses. You are just getting your product done and maybe the production. But as you go through the second, the third, your entire cycle is start overlapping. So if you don't calculate it well, you will struggle financially to circulate the seasons. And if you would lose 45% as an example, how you would back up your second production that you need to do, or second collection that you need to design straight after you deliver it to your store. So that element also, as Trino mentioned, the price construction, it's very important. It's not only the price you get from the fabric mill, the price you get from the manufacturer, and how much fabric consumption is it. Let's add it all up. This is my garment cost. It's not. It goes all the way down to the content of the fabric you are sourcing, all the way down to garment. So it's very easy to think, this is how much does it cost? Like, what else it could get there? But yes, there is a lot going on. The composition of that fiber affects your final cost and margin. So it's very complex, the price construction when it comes to, from fiber composition to the shipment tax, to the warehousing, etc., which is very important, and in addition to what you're developing.
Yeah, because your docket for each garment becomes huge. It's not just about, depending on the size of your business, but quite often you have to include even transportation within production. Whether you're shipping to a warehouse, and if you're shipping garments to a warehouse, that kind of needs to be involved there. If it's not already in your margin, but then you need to put it in the margin. But basically, it's like Hande said, it's not just putting a few things together in a docket and saying that's what it costs. It's much bigger than that, you know. And if your overheads are in your margin, then that's fine. But you need to decide how you structure your dockets and how you structure your costing. But it's not just like, you know, you take the contents of a sandwich and that's what it costs. It's like everything else around it, you know. And you need to sit down and really clearly think about what all those things are. And it can be a very long list.
Yes, it could be a very long and complex list as you move further. And it's almost like opening a can of worms, like it comes all the time something new, because as you start dealing with different borders from different fabric suppliers or different trim suppliers, everything adds in so many legal things that you wouldn't be aware of. So always be conscious that there are so many questions to be asked. It's not just, you know, let's put this together and I'm done. That's why it's one of the key things is where I think it's quite important is the price engineering from day one. From day one that you have that shopping list with your designer, or if yourself or within the brand, you have to think creatively. Yes, okay, this is great, but what will get me and what will take me to get there is entirely something else that needs to take into consideration. Oh, I think we need to talk a little bit range planning during product
I think so,
development.
because exactly. Because you're also mentioning things about committing.
Yeah.
Committing to what you're trying to do.
Yes. So, as Todd mentioned at the very first beginning, committing to your business or committing to your suppliers, providing transparency, either if it's a fabric commitment or manufacturing commitment, how would you commit? right? Without knowing what you're going to do, or how would you commit? So one thing also, while designing the collection, I think there is an element of a conscious collection. I don't want to sound like interjecting the creative process. Creative process has to happen on its own. It's a natural flow, it's beautiful, and it hasn't been touched. But at the same time, when you are doing that, there needs to be an element of collection range planning, we call it. Like how big you want your collection to be. Or if you have, let's say it's your first season, is it sensible of having 100 pieces, or if it's sensible of having 50 pieces? Or what you want your product to be specialized? Do you want to become a brand doing trousers more, or skirts more, or tops, or dress? So it could go in every direction. You could say, I'm going to do only dress, fine. But again, it's building up how you would do your collection so that you can plan everything at the back end when you start sourcing, fabric shopping, manufacturing shopping. If you create a collection that has dresses, skirts, trousers, t-shirts, shirts, it means that all these categories at the back end of the kitchen means different manufacturer, different fabric supplier, different trim supplier, different pricing, different shipment terms, different planning, different critical paths. So planning your collection and the range is also something that is very crucial at the beginning when you start thinking about doing your brand or running your design. From designer point of view, how would you budget your collection?
Well, I would say that basically you need to figure out what you've got to spend. And you need to work backwards. You'll know, like kind of, you'll give yourself a sampling budget based on the range plan that you're trying to do and the SKUs and the number of pieces. You need to know how much that's going to cost. And then you need to know your fabric kind of expenditures. Based on the fact that if you're a small company trying to do it, basically a roll of fabric is going to be around €1,000. 800 to 1,000, that's kind of what it ends up being for your 25 meters of sampling, believe it or not, because of your surcharges and everything. But also I think it's really important that when you're actually doing your range plan and you're you're doing a winter collection, you like coat fabrics, do you need 3 coat fabrics to actually do the collection? It's a common mistake that people just have too many choices type of thing within their range plan. So it's really important that you're actually thinking that through and spending the money correctly. And remember that just because you've got the fabric in your manufacturing, that's not all your budget. There's loads of other things in there. And suddenly before you know it, when you're at the end of the season, you've spent like an extra 10 grand. Like I could do my seasonal planning and then realize that actually what's on the cards of what I want to spend, maybe £50,000. I don't have that. So I need to figure out where to cut and where to put, what don't I need, I think is the main thing. What actually is really important to the brand and what actually fits in the kind of the range plan that you're trying to achieve. It's a common mistake, and I'm sure big companies do it as well as small, so it probably happens all over the place. Because a lot of the design teams because they're working so quickly, so they just seem to be buying and purchasing things without actually thinking of the bigger picture. The other thing too is, you buy a fabric and say, I'll use it next season, you won't. You won't. So I've said that to myself dozens of times before I realize it never happens. The fabric will be wrong, the color will be wrong, and suddenly in 6 months or a year, you'll actually be off it anyways. Yeah. So you'll always make a purchasing mistake. You'll always buy one thing that potentially you won't use. That's part of how it works. You try not to, but I wouldn't beat yourself up over one thing or a couple of things. But when you suddenly realize you've got rolls of sampling fabric that you've never touched, that's a serious problem.
Yep. Just want to back up with you a little bit of real examples of the scale of the businesses, how wrong it could go if you don't do collection range planning from budget perspective. One day, a regular day in the office, something is wrong with numbers and figures. So £2 million over budget in the order book. That's a medium scale of brand, internationally sells. 2 million is a lot of money. And what it comes down to, so finance team are running around, what happened. So it goes down two elements. First, when the collection was at the range planning stage, there had been so many fabric ordered just to get the fabric in and see the proto if the design can use it or not. 50 meters, 100 meters, 20 meters, paying surcharges, a lot of money. That everyone was like, oh, because we're gonna use this fabric, great, we have the sampling fabric to put in production. Let's order it. And production, on the other hand, when they were working with design, that's perfect because we will have this much, fabric, this much in the collection, there is this much t-shirts, etc. Let's order buttons, zippers, hangers, etc., etc. Everything came to an end in that melting pot. Product development, everything ordered massively big and unnecessarily a lot. And production mirroring product development, thinking that everything is going to go in line with what they are developing. They ordered production, and in the end, business were penalized with £2 million with different spectrum, because there is a different elements of ordering minimums, thinking that we will use it, we will sell it. So don't make assumption, or exactly you said, oh, I'll use this fabric, I really like it, you'll get sick of it. That's usually what happens. I'm not a designer, but I come from a background where I develop hands to hands with the designer developing the product. If by not creating that product by myself, if I can get sick of seeing it, you will not use it next season. Any materials that you would think, oh, I will definitely use it, that's not going to happen. And what's going to happen is, at the end of the season, it's gonna be the money that you spend for nothing. It's gonna be your dead stock over the years that you want to get rid of, but you don't know how to get rid of it. You will either dispose it or ending up, donating the fabric for somewhere to do prototyping. I remember times that we shipped 2 big lorries of over-ordered, non-used fabric sampling that we would think we would use it next season. Nothing, doesn't work. That's why collection range planning and keeping it tight and conscious that it's gonna be one season. You will not use that fabric next, or that trim, whatever that is. It's just very important, again, in that sense.
Then just to point out, on the opposite side of that, is that if there is a fabric you find that you can use consistently, that becomes carryover, that's a very interesting aspect to your business. Yeah. Now, we're not talking about a fancy fabric or a jacquard or something. We're talking about something that you can use consistently. You can change color, always do black, and all that stuff all the way through. But then you get an interesting conversation with the supplier as well, because suddenly they can hold grayish for you, or they know the order is coming, or if you're doing 10,000 meters a season, then basically you kind of have a consistent dialogue with them. That also speeds up your production time on those pieces, because suddenly you have like a base carryover collection of pieces in a good fabric that just works and sells really well, and it's a good price. Your conversation with the mill is very, very different, because suddenly you're getting discounts from them, suddenly they're actually producing grayish for you, they're holding grayish for you, and then they can dye it quickly. So those are almost like your first production pieces, because you kind of know it's there. But that's not the same thing as like the fancy fabric that you think you'll use next season. That's like a great base. There's a lot of companies, if you look at their base collections, not runway, if you go to the shop and see, you'll see these fabrics appearing season after season in new shapes and new colors, but it's kind of like, and that's bread and butter. because they can make a lot of money off of that stuff. And it also eases up your production cycle because you at least have one group that you kind of know where you're at. You know how it works. The manufacturers know how to use it. And you can probably ship it early. And those are your best sellers anyway. So get them in and get the money. And they'll buy quantity.
Yep, it's as much as committing to your suppliers with minimum, it's also a commitment to yourself. So we have been always talking the downside of things, but in that element, collection range planning, knowing your core product and what you want to do, on the upside, committing a fabric that you would keep consistently use, it's bread and butter to your business. So let's say you can become an interesting brand of producing your core elements of, let's say, X fabric that you keep running every season. And you have the price momentum, you have faster production, you have price benefits of manufacturing, fabric, and fast turnaround. Again, when we talk about collection range planning, it's not about, oh, I have to plan this so carefully so I don't use any fabric next season. No, there will be fabric you can use next season, but again, understanding what you want to do and understanding that product that sells well, that you see it, and then you create it. So there are also always an upcycle. You have to constantly changing the scenario of what you're thinking. There is downsides, but there is a lot of upsides to it as well.
Not really. I mean, the only way that I think you can get around that is basically the scale of the business. So basically, you can buy currency. So, which is what I basically, when I had my business, when the euro was good, I could buy it, and then I would have a euro bank account. So I would buy my fabrics, and all the money from the stores in euros would go in there. So that was one way of doing it. So yes, you can, but at the same time, it depends on the scale of your business.
There is an element of both yes and no. Obviously, building up your brand, you will have your own voice of that brand, like how you would like to communicate with your customers as a brand, as you would design a product. So yes, there needs to be, I think there is no fast and hard rules. There has to be an essence of the product relevancy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can mirror. Yes, you can evolve, but at the same time, one thing that needs to be looked at is, again, the sales performance of that specific product. So you can like, for example, one dress that you love and that's the worst seller, and the dress that you ideally not a big fan of in that collection is the best seller. So insisting on the worst seller product, it's not going to win you anything, because that's not going to be the best seller next season. But evolving your collection based on the elements of best and worst seller, vice versa, would bring you a momentum of your sales. But obviously, you cannot think of all the commercial angles of your brand while creating the product. Otherwise, you would use that essence. You cannot bring a lot of commercial aspects of it, but at the same time, finding that tuned balance in between what sells best and what sells worst, and then you evolve your collection from there. So there is basically an element of creativity that you have to keep, but an element of little bit of analytics and data in there. And when you find that tuned balance, 50-50, you will see naturally in an organic form your collections will evolve.
Plus nowadays, buyers say they only want to see new, but they loved what you did last season. So it's complicated. For me personally, one of my toughest lessons was actually relying that a fabric supplier was actually going to deliver the fabric. I contacted them the day or a week before it was going to be delivered, to find out that they hadn't bought the yarn. They were going under. They were a big company, and they were well known. They were going under. They hadn't bought the yarn. My fabric was due to go to the factory in a week. And it was a coat fabric, which for me was a huge part of my collection and a huge part of my sales. And so I had to run around. This is the one I was sort of saying, where I had a friend, a mill, who basically bailed me out. I still shipped late, but it was one of those things where I probably would have been a little bit more in contact with the mills as I went along, just to check the delivery dates, get to know, Gail on the phone at the office, and just sort of have friendly conversation and just sort of track what's happening. Don't expect that by a miracle it's just going to turn up when they said they would do it. Quite often they're late. You'll get to know the suppliers who you can trust. This one, though, was an anomaly to that because they were a big company. They've since gone out of business, but I swear they were massive, a huge, huge, huge company, and they're gone. And it was a nightmare. I mean, but we talk about critical path, and you do your planning, and planning's important. But the thing is that you need to be so organized, because when these things happen, it's at least something that you may be able to deal with. You can imagine if your critical path's a mess, and this happens, and 2 or 3 other things happen, you're probably out of business. Because nowadays, the stores almost rely on a late delivery so they can cancel it. Saves them budget. You're late, they don't want it. You're out, type of thing. I mean, they do that. They overbuy, knowing that percentage of orders aren't going to happen, and some people aren't going to ship. Some of them will accept it with a discount. We don't want that. But the worst case scenario, and I've had it myself, on a late shipment, they don't want it. So you're kind of stuffed on those. But that's why this critical path, it's really organization and planning. And I can't stress how organized you need to be. You need to work backwards. You need to sort of say, my in-store date, because that's different than a shipping date, because they want the stuff in store by a certain date, and you need to find out how many weeks it takes to get in store. Some places it's a day, some places it's a week, some places it's 2 weeks. You don't know what. So suddenly your shipping changes, then your production time, your fabric lead times, your components, and then suddenly you realize you have to order the fabric 3 weeks before you go into sales campaign to actually make your delivery date. And as a big company, you can punt. As a small company, I tried, it never works. You literally, I've got factories with hundreds of meters of fabric because I punted and I got it wrong, because when you're small, you can't. That's why these kind of carryover fabrics become very interesting for a business. Because in colors, yeah, you might be a bit screwed, but in black, that's for life.
It sounds funny now, but it didn't sound funny at that time when I was going through my tough lessons within my product development and production world. So you punch the fabric to get the fabric weight, and it creates like a big hole. It's like a punching blades. So we're developing a product, and I needed to resource the fabric at a cheaper, faster time, and there is one sample we punched in to send the cutting to the supplier. So there's one big hole at the back of the garment where we punched the fabric. So down the road, we got lucky, we find the fabric, and there was only one prototype that we could hold on to for measurements, because punching the fabric in the garment at the back didn't change its overall measurement. So we labeled that fabric and sent it to the factory to produce it and ship it to us. So the BOM was there, the design was there. So we didn't check, thinking that, they have the final measurements, everything, etc. The product came to warehouse, 1,000 pieces with a hole at the back. Gone. So that's why I was saying triple check, almost being a control freak of what you do, because we all rushing things because the environment is so fast forward, and during the day you're like, oh, okay, I need to send the garment, pack and send. If you don't follow up, nobody reads your brain. Everybody knew in the room, in the office, that you would never get a fabric with the whole punch at the back you would produce. They punched the whole production and overlooked. They did a design themselves. So never think that, you know, people reads your brain, especially, you know, when you have all your different suppliers, different people. Different culture means different way of thinking. They thought that the product was final because we sent the final. So yes, there are different lessons, I'm sure, in different angles.
Usually the rule is that if a mistake happens, it's your fault.
Yes.
And that is probably what happens. You know, you need to give whether it's factories. I mean, even when it comes to ordering fabric, I always sent a swatch. And if it wasn't in the color, I said it wasn't color, and a color standard was with it. It wasn't about a number. You know, those are the things that can save you. And situations like this, I've heard that's not the first time I've heard those types of stories. You know? And also there's a language barrier quite often. You're working with a factory in Italy, you don't speak Italian, you know, you need to somehow communicate with them. The second season is the nightmare when you're starting. Because the big thing to remember about this critical path, so we start the cycle, you have to remember that as the cycle's finishing, the second one is starting already. So it seems easy when you're like designing and you're sourcing and you're making a collection. The first one's great. You know, you do your sales, you're all happy, and then suddenly you're doing your production, and then you're like, oh my God, I have to do it again. And I remember the first time I did when I did the second season, it comes at you at lightning speed, and you really can make a huge mistake. So when you're starting your first season, you need to know already when the second one's coming in. So there's no advice other than to just be ready.
Brace for impact.
It's a nightmare, you know, because suddenly you're doing production, you're doing samples. And I've heard lots of designer friends of mine, well into their maybe fourth, fifth season, quite famous, on the phone saying, do I pay for sampling or do I pay for production? I don't have enough money. Do I ship the goods or do I get the new stuff for the showroom? When you're starting out, it's not easy. Some people do 4, some people do 3. You know, I think at the end of the day, your customer, they need to be satisfied with what you're doing. So, and some stores have an open to buy all year round. I mean, Net-a-Porter, that was their policy at one point. They had an open budget to just buy as long as they had goods on time. I think the main thing is you need to make your deliveries. If you don't make it, which is all what this critical path goes down to at the end of the day. It's like getting the clothes in the store on time. And if you don't, there's no business. You know, that's so important. And also the other thing too, just a little thing which I'd thought about when we were discussing it, in terms of like your suppliers, pay them. They won't work with you if you don't. And phoning them up and saying that the stores haven't paid me, because guess what? The stores will be a nightmare to get the money from them. They always are. That's something that hasn't changed for a long time. But you need to pay your suppliers. So that also goes back into your sourcing. Make sure that you're working within a budget that works. Because if you don't, the suppliers won't work with you, and then you're stuffed. The stores will go to another brand. They'll buy another designer. But you need your suppliers. So treat them well.